Hello everybody, my name is James, and today I'm going to show you how I built this aquarium cabinet. But first, I'd like to say a big thank you to all of my patrons over at Patreon. I'd also like to say thank you to everybody who uses the links in the descriptions of my videos to purchase things that they need, and to all of my subscribers. All of your support helps make this channel possible. So today I have a little bit of a strange project. It's for my oldest daughter, and originally it was supposed to be a terrarium shelf. I had one piece of walnut plywood left over from a job, and a bunch of Baltic birch pieces as well, and so this was going to be more of a utilitarian project. My plan was to use the walnut for the sides and the Baltic birch for the shelves, and I thought it would give a nice contrast to this shelf. And these are the walnut sides, and I have already edge banded them, which I've shown how to do in a previous video in case you're interested. And I'm clamping up the two side supports with the Baltic birch in the middle, and I have pre-drilled pocket screws about every 4 inches along the way, and that's how the bulk of the assembly is going to go on this project. It doesn't have to hold a whole lot of weight. It's a 40-gallon terrarium, and she has a snake in it, so I think in total it's about 40 pounds. And my youngest daughter here is finishing up the last of the pocket holes for me. And I've temporarily clamped on some aluminum squares so that I can get the top shelf square. And we don't expect that it's going to hold much weight. I think she's planning to mount a light underneath it to light up the terrarium, and she'll maybe put a plant or something on top of that. So everything up to this point was pretty fast, maybe a day or two to put it together. And this is really what the project was supposed to look like when it was all done. And then she came to me and told me that she had noticed one of the cabinets that I built recently had a pedestal base on it, which she really liked a lot. As opposed to this shelf here, just sitting on the ground, she wanted me to incorporate something like this pedestal base, and she was really hoping at the corners I could do some through dovetail joinery. So one of the things that I'm actually used to is when I take too long to build my daughter's things, they tend to change their mind partway through, and so we just kind of go with the flow and modify the build as she likes it. So I have cut some 4-inch wide boards of walnut for the pedestal base, and I am going to put them on my dovetail jig and cut dovetails in them. For anyone interested, I do have older videos that show how I do dovetails, but my very next video after this coming up is a comprehensive through dovetail tutorial. And those are the tails. We always cut the tails first when we do through dovetails, and then we switch and make the pin cuts next. This setup is a little different than normal because I have to mount my dovetail jig sideways on the table because the length of the boards that I'm cutting the dovetails on extend back about 4 or 5 feet. Once the dovetails are cut, I glue them up. I have clamped them all together, and I've got a couple of squares that I'm holding lightly in there with clamps to make sure that my glue up stays perfectly square. And you can see this is the front part with the through dovetails. Once they're dry, I just take it apart, and I'll use a belt sander first with 36 grit to take the dovetails down to flush, and I'll follow that up with a random orbit sander to make it perfect. And now I'm going to fit a piece of Baltic birch plywood in here that I cut in order to complete the top part of this pedestal base. And with the pedestal base still upside down, I have glued in little 3-inch strips of Baltic birch ply all the way around, and those are actually going to be the support which carries that Baltic birch, the 3/4 inch plywood part that's on top. Now that I flipped it over, you can't really see those side supports, you just see the top, and it comes up flush to the top of the walnut. Now it's time to put a decorative edge around the perimeter of this walnut pedestal. This bit is called a classical cutter bit, and I'll put links to this and actually all of the tools and specialty pieces of equipment that I use There'll be links for all those in the description in case you're interested. And here it is complete. I do think the project is probably going to look a lot better with this pedestal base as opposed to just your standard bookshelf look that'll sit against a wall. And I'm going to glue the shelf itself down onto the pedestal base, and I'm going to screw it from underneath. So we've gone from a terrarium shelf, which is what I was originally building for her, to a terrarium stand with a pedestal base. So unfortunately, it took me about a month to get to this stage because I got busy with other projects, and in the meantime, she got to thinking that she'd like to have a 10-gallon aquarium sit on top of that. And I knew it wouldn't hold the 10-gallon aquarium like that, so we went back to the drawing board and decided to beef that up a little bit. I'm cutting some support boards at long angles to match the existing angles on the walnut, and I'm using my tapering jig. I do have a video here on how to build this jig. And there it is. They go into the sides like that, and they're going to allow that to carry a whole lot more weight than what it would have carried otherwise. And I think it still sort of fits within the same design theme as well. So we started off with a terrarium shelf. It moved to kind of a terrarium stand with a pedestal base, and now it's sort of an aquarium stand. In addition to gluing those sides on, I'm sending some screws down through the top to kind of help hold those diagonal races in place as well. And since there's a long span from the left to the right side of this, I have decided to double up that piece of plywood. So instead of a 3/4 inch thick shelf, it's going to be an 1.5 inch thick shelf. And I'm going to thoroughly glue those two components together so it'll be bonded together as if it's a single solid 1.5 inch thick piece of wood. I think that's going to prevent any deflection that might occur if we put weight up on it. Once again, it's important that you know that there is no such thing as too much glue. The reason you see the level here is that it is acting as a straight edge. If I were to push down on just the single board by itself, it could bow a little bit at the bottom. So I'm just using this as a straight edge to make sure these two boards are flat and straight as I clamp them together. And I put some extra weight on there. You see my 50-pound vise and a bunch of other weights. And I'm sad to report it took me about another month to get to this stage. By that time, my daughter was noticing some of these raised panel doors I was doing on other projects and decided she really needed raised panel doors to cover up the bottom open part. So I decided to do that for her. So to start with here, we have to glue up the wood to make the panels for the raised panel portion in the center. Here I'm just going to briefly outline the steps of building raised panel doors, but I do have a video, and I'll put a link to it, on how to build raised panel doors. The next step was to cut the rails and stiles that are going to go around the center panel door, and so I ripped those to the correct width on the table saw. After that, we take them over to the router table and put the profiles on for the cope and stick doors. And once the raised panel portions are done, I cut them down to size, and then I take them over to the router table to cut in the profile for the raised panel itself. And there's what it looks like. And here, another one of my daughters, Maya, is helping me to build the project, and she's assembling the door for me. And we only glue the rails and the stiles together. We don't glue the center panel in place. The center panel has to float so that it can expand and contract. And now that the doors are done, I need to make some mounting brackets to secure the middle door in place. The middle door won't swing open or closed, so I've just cut some 3/4 inch by 3/4 inch square stock, And I'm going to drill some holes in it, mount it in the middle, and then permanently mount the middle door to this. As you might have expected, it's still going a little bit slow, and my next thought is she's probably going to ask me to make it strong enough to hold an aquarium on the main shelf, a 40-gallon aquarium. This would be quite a bit heavier than the terrarium she originally had planned for it, but I think by putting this middle door in with solid mounts, it'll add a tremendous amount of strength to the front part of this shelf. So the majority of this shelf is held in by pocket screws on 3 sides, and if anyone out there might be concerned about the strength of those pocket screws, you might want to check out my pocket screw strength test video, and you can see how strong they really are. Once this was done, however, we did test the shelf unit, the main unit, and it held 1,000 pounds of weight with 0 sag, so I don't think a 300 or 400 pound 40-gallon tank will pose any problem for it. So once that door is mounted, we'll turn our attention back to the other 2 doors that we made, and I've got to put some holes in them. They're 35mm holes in order to mount these Euro hinges. Once that's done, we will put the hinge plates onto the shelf itself. And I have used Bloom hinges for this. They're a Bloom soft close hinge. They just snap on and off. They're very easy to use, and I'll put links for those in the description in case anybody might be interested. And so now it's kind of funny. We have gone from a terrarium shelf to a terrarium stand with a pedestal base to an aquarium stand and now to an aquarium cabinet with raised panel doors. So seeing how we have done all this, I just don't think that Baltic birch looks great anymore. So I have decided to cover it with 1/4-inch cherry plywood. This piece of cherry ply is going to go on top of the main shelf in the middle, so I've got to notch it to get around that plywood vertical triangular post that I had to put in. And it looks like it might be time for me to get a new pull saw. I guess I've got to stop spending so much money on glue so I can buy some new tools. Okay, so I will try a test fit and see how it goes. And that looks pretty good. I think I can live with that. Now I think I need to cut another piece of cherry for the back, so I don't have to look at that Baltic birch back piece. And a quick dry fit here. It looks like that's going to work out fine too. And there's a quick glimpse. Looks pretty good. I think what started out as a utilitarian shelf is turning into a nice cabinet. Okay, now we will glue those pieces of plywood in place. And even though we're only adding 1/4 inch of thickness to this shelf, it actually adds quite a bit of strength. Since it is glued over the entire surface and bonded together, we have what essentially is now a 1-inch thick shelf unit. And I'm going to glue the back piece in place as well. It's a little difficult when you're forced to glue onto a vertical surface. I just like to squirt the glue on, and you don't have a whole lot of time to get out rollers, so I find it best to just put on a latex glove and spread the glue that way. And whenever you're gluing up plywood, it's very important to use a damp cloth and get all of the glue squeeze out up right away. The veneer layer on the outside of the plywood, which is cherry, is very thin, and you wouldn't be able to sand that off without damaging the surface of the plywood. And it looks like my daughter had just enough time to photobomb this scene while she was cleaning off the glue. And I think to complete the look, we're going to have to put a piece of cherry on the very top as well. And that's just fine with me. I'll use any excuse I can to use more glue. And she's laughing because she knew I was going to say something funny about that glue. Well, I don't know where Sai is going there, but hopefully she's going to get more glue. It's important to get a lot of clamps on this and a lot of weight to get a secure bond. Once the glue was dry, I noticed that the plywood on top was actually set back just a tiny bit from the remainder of the plywood. The 1/4-inch piece was set back a little bit. So I used a flush trim bit with the bearing on top to bring everything down to be perfectly flush and even. This is a pretty handy bit to have. Sometimes you need to have the bearing on the bottom, and sometimes you need to have it on the top. So I'll put a link to this in the description in case anybody is interested in this type of a router bit. And of course I have gone this far in making it into a fine cabinet from what was originally just a utilitarian shelf. So I think I'm going to have to go ahead and trim that upper shelf all the way around with some solid walnut. And I'll start by trimming the 2 side edges first. I used a bevel gauge on the piece to see what angle I needed it cut at. And the long edge of this side piece has a long angle cut on it. I'm just going to cut it close to the line with my jigsaw, and I'll bring it over to my disc sander and sand it down to exactly the point of the line. And that's how I'm going to trim out the side of this shelf. Lots of glue there on the plywood, especially because it's going to absorb quite a bit. And my daughter Sai here is helping me to mark the final piece in front. There's really 2 ways to do something like this. You can hold it up to where it needs to be and you can mark it, or you could measure it and with a tape measure and then mark it that way. Both methods work. Whenever I can, though, I tend to like to put the piece into place and use that to actually put my mark on. And this is going to be the final glue up of this project. We did let this sit up overnight to dry, and so on the next day here we're going to take off our clamps, and I think I'm going to put a chamfer around the top edge of that walnut. A lot of times when routing, I do like to route a chamfer or roundover, for example. I like them to go all the way to the end, and in those cases it's better to put the chamfer on before you put the piece in place. Sometimes that isn't practical, as we did here. I needed to clamp this in place, and so now I'm routering it after the fact. And this actually presents a good opportunity for a lot of woodworkers who don't have much experience with hand tools to try to finish the chamfer by hand. I have a wood rasp here, and we'll just take our time and go real slow and try to get it down to match the bevel exactly. We'll use a wood rasp and we'll use sandpaper, go back and forth a couple of times, and it's really not too hard to do. And I think that came out all right. As with anything, the more you practice, the better you get at anything. So this is something that you should take the time to practice as often as you can. And so my youngest daughter is going to finish this out for us. This is one of her favorite tasks. She loves to do spray-on lacquer. She's actually pretty skilled at it. She's been doing it for a while. The lacquer I like to use is made by a company called Deft, D-E-F-T, and this is a satin lacquer finish. We do have a very good airflow system set up in the shop. You can probably see it's drawing all of the extra spray away from her. But even if you have that, you absolutely must wear a respirator when you spray lacquer. The fumes from that can make you very ill and cause brain damage, in fact. So you have to have a respirator when spraying lacquer. And she's actually showing very good technique here. You want to try to maintain a uniform 6 to 9 inches away from the surface. Begin your spray above the top and don't stop spraying until you get past the bottom. And that really does make that walnut stand out. After this, we removed the doors, and then I sprayed the cherry part on the inside here. So you want to be prepared whenever you spray into a pocket or a cavity or inside of a shelf. You do get a lot of blowback from the sprayer. And so another thing that is important to note is because she just sprayed the sides, some of her overspray went onto this cherry, and so I wanted to make sure that I got the cherry sprayed before that had a chance to dry. Although lacquer is pretty forgiving, you can always sand it and refinish it. And so that wraps up this project. This is actually the next morning here. The project is completely dry, and we gave it 3 coats of lacquer and then hand sanded it with 1000 grit paper between the second and third coat. It's a nice satin look, and I think the cabinet came out pretty nice overall. Thank you very much for watching.